This lecture is going to be about the nervous system of our body. This is an amazing control system that we have. This is the major system that controls our actions, our thoughts, our memories. There's a lot of things that go into the nervous system. All of us are familiar with our brain. We know that we couldn't function without a brain. We talk a lot about how much we use our brain and our brain growing, connections in our brain. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the anatomy and also the physiology of the nervous system, including the brain, and how this all works together to control the systems in our body. So first of all, there's some terms we need to know here. We need to know how this nervous system works. The nervous system works through a series of inputs and then also outputs. So we have information coming into the nervous system. This is always going to be in the form of sensory input. We have nerve endings. We have these different things inside our nervous system that are constantly receiving information from the outside world. And we're taking that information into the nervous system, and then we're deciding what to do with it. And then we have the output. And the output is most likely going to be some sort of motor output, some sort of movement, some sort of something that is being caused to happen. So we have the sensory input. This would be what we call stimuli. So, for example, we receive information about the temperature of our body. Then this is sent to be integrated, to be processed, and in general that's going to happen in the brain, but also there are some integration systems that happen in the spinal cord as well. So not everything has to go clear the brain. If it's a reflex or if it's something that doesn't need process, then often the spinal cord can take care of it. Then finally we have the output, the motor output, where we're activating some muscles or some glands or something in order to react to that stimuli. And also drawn in a picture something like this. So we have our sensory organs coming in, integrating, and then it's moving out into the input. Our nervous system can be broken up into a number of different categories. First of all, there's two major categories that we have. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is simply the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. So those are the two major divisions of the nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, we can further break down into some functional categories. The central nervous system, that's as broken down as it gets. Peripheral nervous system, we have the sensory system and we have the motor system. The sensory system is coming from the sense organs, taking this information, sending it back to the peripheral nervous system, and then it can be sent up to the central nervous system to be processed and then brought back. And then we have the motor system coming back out. There's a couple words here, afferent and efferent. Afferent always means going towards. Efferent means going away from. So the sensory system is moving towards the central nervous system. The efferent system is moving away from the central nervous system. The efferent pathway can further be broken down into voluntary and involuntary systems. We have the somatic system. This is our voluntary system. This is mostly made up of skeletal muscles because those are the muscles that we voluntarily control. Then we have what's called the autonomic system, and this is involuntary. We don't have conscious control of these systems. We're still constantly receiving sensory input, and our brain is always putting out this, the central nervous system is giving out this output, but we're not consciously deciding what to do. Our brain is automatically taking care of that for us. And this is regarding cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, things that it'll control, our brain will control subconsciously. We don't have to, and we can't actually control ourselves consciously. The autonomic system can further be broken down to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. And these are two systems that work opposite of each other. And you may have heard of this idea of fight or flight type reactions. That's the parasympathetic and sympathetic system. So when we receive sensory input, we can either decide we either have like a fight or flight reaction, or the opposite would be the rest and digest. And so that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic system are going to be controlling that, depending on the situation. So this is a breakdown of the nervous system. So you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system is the big two. Within the peripheral system, we can further break it down to sensory and motor. And then within the motor system, we can further break down in somatic and autonomic. Then autonomic can be broken down to parasympathetic and sympathetic. So there's a lot of different categories here. And as we go through this lecture series on the nervous system, we'll be looking at a lot of different aspects of these different parts here. Next, though, we're going to look at the different cells that make up the central nervous system and also the peripheral nervous system. In general, we have two types of nervous system cells. We have neuroglial cells and we have neurons. If I was to ask you what cells make up the nervous system, you and most people you'd probably come in contact with would first think of neurons. And that's very true. Neurons are the stars of the system. And that's what everybody thinks of. Oh, our neurons, they're the ones that actually send the electrical signal, and that's where we're going to be spending most of our time in this section, is learning about neurons and how they send those signals, how they are able to take in this input and give out this output and control all the functions of our body. So neurons are important, and they're the stars of the show. But neuroglial cells, these are the behind-the-scenes actors. These are the guys that don't get a lot of recognition or respect, but they're very important and essential to the working of the nervous system. In fact, the neuroglial cells far outnumber the number of neurons in our system. These are our support cells. These are the guys that make sure that neurons have what they need in order to get the job done. If anything goes wrong with our neuroglial cells, our neurons aren't going to be able to function. So within the central nervous system, we have a few different types of neuroglial cells, often just called glial cells. We have what's called the astrocyte. We have a microglial cell, ependymal cell, and then the long one, oligodendrocytes, which is, once you learn how to say that word, it's kind of a cool word, but at first it looks pretty daunting. Within the peripheral nervous system, we have Schwann cells and we have satellite cells. Astrocyte cells. These are the cells that, again, these are in the central nervous system, and their job is to support the neuron. Neurons need a lot of energy. Think about our brain. It's the most energy hungry organ in our body. It always needs all this food and nutrients. We'll talk about the electrolytes that are needed in our brain as well. And so this astrocyte cell, its job is to support the neuron. So in the background here we have a neuron. This would be the axon of the neuron, the projection, where that signal is going to head down. Here's our astrocyte in the middle. It looks kind of like a star. Think of maybe an asteroid. That's a good way to remember the astrocyte. And it has all these arms or these projections, and notice that it's connected to the neuron. And so it's feeding and it's supporting the neuron. It's holding it in place. And then also it has arms that are connected to the capillaries. So these capillaries, this is where the blood is coming. It's going to have the nutrients. It's going to have the oxygen needed for the neurons to function. And so the astrocyte is taking those nutrients and oxygen from the capillary, and it's feeding the neurons, supporting them. So the astrocytes, this is the most abundant type of support cell in the central nervous system. Next we have microglial cells, and these look kind of like spiders. These guys are phagocytes. So remember, a phagocyte is a type of cell that ingests other cells or debris or things like that by surrounding them and pulling them into the cell and then breaking them down that way. So these are the cleanup crew. So they're crawling. They're in the CNS system. And they're not really crawling around. So they're not like white blood cells that are crawling around within the tissues. They're in a certain spot, but they're monitoring, they're helping to make sure that remove any dead material, debris, or anything so that the neurons are able to function and do their job. That's the microglial cell. The next cell we have is the ependymal cell. And these guys are interesting looking cells. You can see them here. They have these little cilia, or hair-like projections on the cell, and these cilia are going to beat back and forth. And so what's going to happen here is this is going to cause the fluid to move around within the central nervous system. So when we talk about the brain, we'll look at the fluid in the brain. So there's what you've probably heard of spinal fluid. There's brain and spinal fluid that's surrounding the brain, surrounding the spinal cord, and this fluid has to be in a constant motion. So its job is, it functions as a cleaning, also has some support functions, protection as well, and so it constantly has to be moving, and also it's constantly replaced as well. And so these ependymal cells, as they move around, they circulate that fluid around the brain and around the spinal cord. And then finally, we have the long name here, the oligodendrocyte. And the oligodendrocyte cells have an interesting job because what they're doing is producing myelin. Myelin is very important when it comes to the nervous system in general. Myelin is, an easy way to think about myelin is it's a insulation. So something you might be familiar with if you've ever seen a wire that you use to wire a house or something like that. You have the wire, and around that wire you're going to have a covering of insulation. And the function of that insulation is to protect the wire, but it also allows that electrical signal to move down the wire, and it's not going to be interfered with because it's insulated, and so that electrical signal can't go anywhere but down the wire. So it's going to help make that electrical signal stronger, but then also it's going to make that electrical signal faster as well. Our nervous system is an electrical system. The way that it functions is by sending electrical signals throughout the body. And so this myelin works just like the insulation on a wire. It insulates our wiring in our body. It insulates the neurons, the axons of the neurons. So an oligodendrocyte, as you can see here, here's the cell body, and it has a nucleus there. Then it has these little projections, and they reach out, and then they wrap the neurons in this fatty material that insulates and allows that electrical signal to work well. The oligodendrocyte can myelinate. We say the word myelinate. That's the verb for creating myelin sheaths. It can myelinate a number of neurons. Just this one cell can. If the myelin breaks down, or if you don't have myelin on the nerves of the nervous system, then this is going to lead to diseases. Your nervous system is not going to function. Perhaps you've heard of a disease called multiple sclerosis. And sclerosis is the breakdown of the myelin sheaths in the brain. And so people that have multiple sclerosis lose functioning of their nervous system because basically their brain is short-circuiting. It's not able to work how it's supposed to. So those are the cells of the central nervous system, the support cells. We looked at astrocytes, the star-shaped cells that nourish the neurons, the microglial cells that clean up, the ependymal cells that circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, and then oligodendrocytes, which are dealing with myelination. The peripheral nervous system has only two types of cells. We have Schwann cells and we have satellite cells. Schwann cells, they deal with myelination. They myelinate the neurons of the peripheral nervous system. And then the satellite cells, they're the support cells. So the satellite cells basically do the job of the astrocytes and the microglial cells. We don't have any epidermal cells in the peripheral nervous system because we don't have that fluid. And then the Schwann cells do the same job as the oligodendrocytes. So those are the different cells, the neuroglial cells that make up the central nervous system and the peripheral system. Now let's take a minute and talk a little bit about neurons and what they look like and what their job is. Well, before we go there, though, I forgot to mention one thing, and that is that Schwann cells, in the case of oligodendrocytes that myelinate the neurons of the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes can myelinate a number of neurons, but Schwann cells, which are in the peripheral nervous system, they each only myelinate a single neuron. And here you can see a neuron in the peripheral nervous system, and each of these little bubble-looking things are myelinated sheaths. Those are the Schwann cells. So this one neuron has all these Schwann cells along the length. Notice that there's a little space in between these Schwann cells. That's going to become important here in a minute when we talk about the functioning of the neurons. And then we have the satellite cells, and notice how they're located around the cell body of the neuron, and they're able to support and give that neuron the nourishment and things that it needs. Now let's look at the neuron just for a minute here. A neuron is an interesting looking cell. These can be the longest or are the longest cells in our body, or they can be really, really short. The longest nerve that we have goes from the end of our spinal cord clear down to our big toe. So you see it's a very long cell because it has these projections called axons that the impulse, the electrical impulse, is able to move down. A neuron also has a cell body. The cell body is where the normal parts of a cell that you'd think of are located. So in this case, here's our cell body, here's our nucleus, here's the mitochondria, the other organelles that you'd expect to find in a cell that allow it to function. Then from the cell body, we have these processes. We have two types of processes. We have one that's called an axon, and the other that is called a dendrite. And a dendrite, these are kind of like the roots of the neuron. They receive signals. This is where the neuron connects with other neurons that are coming in. So let's say we have a neuron here, and it has this axon coming out, and it's sending a signal. It's going to come in contact with the dendrites of this axon here, of this neuron here. And so these dendrites are all the projections sticking out the end of the cell body. One neuron can have many dendrites, as you can see here, all these roots, all these branches coming off the cell body. So it can be receiving signals from all these other axons as they're coming in. All these other nerves can be sending signals here. An axon, there's only ever one axon per neuron. And the axon is the leaving. This is where the signal is going to. So a signal's coming in this way, reaching the dendrites, coming into the cell body, and then it's going to move down the axon. Notice the axon can have branches later on, but coming out of the cell body, there's just one single axon headed out of the cell body. Okay, the axon has has the electrical signal sending it out to other places, whether it's going to be to other cells, or maybe it's going to synapse or attach to a muscle cell. So here we have an axon terminal. We've seen that before when we were looking at muscle function. So maybe this could be coming out and attaching to a muscle and sending a signal there. Notice the myelination of the Schwann cells myelinating this axon. And then we have these spaces, and we're going to name these spaces now. These are called the nodes of Ranvier. And they're important in the movement of the electrical signal down the neuron. Because the myelination is like insulation, you have to have these little spaces to allow the signal to keep moving. That's what the nodes of Ranvier do. That's where we're going to stop this part of the lecture, and that gives us an introduction to the nervous system, the types of cells in the nervous system that we need to know.